Modern History, Chapter 4, Part 4. Read along as I speak the lines. Humanitarian measures, administrative organization, and social and cultural policy. Chapter number 4, Modern History. Humanitarian measures. The official British efforts at reforming Indian society of its abuses were on the whole very meagre and therefore bore little fruit. Their biggest achievement was the outlawing of the practice of sati in 1829, when William Bentinck made it a crime to associate in any way with the burning of a widow on her husband's pyre. Earlier, the British rulers had been apathetic and afraid of arousing the anger of Orthodox Indians. It was only after Ram Mohan Roy and other enlightened Indians and the missionaries agitated persistently for the abolition of the monstrous custom that the government agreed to take this humanitarian step. Many Indian rulers in the past, including Akbar and Aurangzeb and the Peshwas, the Jai Singh of Jaipur, had made unsuccessful attempts to suppress this evil practice. In the case of Bentinck, deserves praise for having acted resolutely in outlawing the practice which had been taken a toll of 800 lives in Bengal alone between 1815 and 1818, and for refusing to bow before the opposition of the orthodox supporters of the practice of sati. Female infanticide, or the practice of killing female children at the time of their birth, had prevailed amongst some of the Rajput clans and other castes because of the paucity of young men who died in large numbers in warfare and because of the difficulties of earning a livelihood in the unfertile areas, and in parts of western and central India because of the prevalence of the evil custom of dowry in a virulent form. Regulations prohibiting infanticide had been passed in 1795 and 1802, but they were sternly enforced only by Bentinck and Hardin. In 1856, the Government of India passed an act enabling Hindu widows to remarry. The government acted after Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and other reformers had carried a prolonged agitation in the favor of the measure. The immediate effects of this act were negligible. All these official reforms touched no more than the fringes of the Indian social system and did not affect the life of the vast majority of people. It was perhaps not possible for a foreign government to do more. Spread of modern education. The British were more successful in the introduction of modern education. Of course, the spread of modern education was not solely the work of the government. The Christian missionaries and a large number of enlightened Indians also played an important part. For the first 60 years of the dominion in India, the East India Company, a trading, profit making concern, took little interest in the education of its subjects. There were, however, two very minor exceptions in this policy. In 1781, Warren Hastings set up the Calcutta Madrasa for the study and teaching of Muslim law and related subjects. And in 1791, Jonathan Duncan started a Sanskrit college at Varanasi, where he was the resident for the study of Hindu law and philosophy. Both these institutions were designed to provide a regular supply of qualified Indians to help the administration of law in the courts of the company. Missionaries and their supporters and many humanitarians soon began to exert pressure on the company to encourage and promote modern, secular, westernized education in India. While the humanitarians, including many Indians, believed that modern knowledge would be the best remedy for social, economic, and political ills of the country, the missionaries believed that the modern education would destroy the faith of the people in their own religions and lead them to adopt Christianity. A humble beginning was made in 1813 when the Charter Act incorporated a principle of encouraging learned Indians and promoting the knowledge of modern sciences in the country. The act directed the company to spend the sum of 1 lakh rupees for the purpose. But even this petty amount was not made available by the company authorities till 1823. For years, a great controversy raged in the country on the question of the direction of this expenditure should take. While one section opinion wanted to spend it exclusively for the promotion of modern Western education, others decided that while Western sciences and literature should be taught to prepare students to take up jobs, emphasis should be placed on the expansion of traditional Indian learning. Even among those who wanted to spread Western learning, differences arose on the question of medium of instruction to be adopted in modern schools and colleges. Some recommended the use of Indian languages called vernaculars at that time for the purpose, while others advocated the use of English. Unfortunately, there was a great deal of confusion on this question. Many people failed to distinguish between the English as a medium and English as a subject for study, and between Indian languages as media and traditional Indian learning as the main object of study. The two controversies were settled in 1835 when the government of India decided to devote the limited resources it was willing to spare to the teaching of Western sciences and literature through the medium of English language alone. Lord Macaulay, who was a law member of the Governor General's Council, argued at the famous minute that Indian languages were not sufficiently developed to serve the purpose, and that the Oriental learning was completely inferior to European learning. It was noted that though Macaulay's views betrayed prejudice against and ignorance of India's past achievements in the realms of science and thought, he was on solid ground when he held European knowledge in the fields of physical and social sciences to be superior to the existing Indian knowledge, which, though advanced at one time, had stagnated too long and lost touch with reality. That is why the most advanced Indians of the time, led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, fervently advocated the study of Western knowledge, which was seen by them as the key to the treasures of scientific and democratic thought of the modern West. They also realized that traditional education had bred superstition, fear, and authoritarianism. In other words, they realized that the salvation of the country lay in going forward and not in looking backwards. In fact, no prominent Indian of the 19th and 20th centuries deviated from this approach. Moreover, throughout the period of modern history, the pressure exerted by the Indian anxious to imbibe Western knowledge played an important part in persuading the government to expand its educational activities on modern lines. The government of India acted quickly, particularly in Bengal, on this decision of 1835 and made English the medium of instruction in its school and colleges. It opened a few English schools and colleges instead of a large number of elementary schools. This policy was later sharply criticized for neglecting the education of the masses. In fact, the emphasis of opening the institutes of modern and higher education was not wrong. If for nothing else, a large number of schools and colleges were needed to educate and train the teachers for elementary schools. But along with the spread of higher education, the education for masses should have been taken in hand. This the government would not do, as it is not willing to spend more than an insignificant sum on education. To make up for the positive expenditure on education, the officials had recourse to the so-called downward filtration theory. Since the allocated funds could educate only a handful of Indians, it was decided to spend them in educating a few persons from the upper and middle classes who were expected to assume the task of educating the masses and spreading modern ideas among them. Education and modern ideas were thus supposed to filter or radiate downwards from the upper classes. This policy continued until the very end of the British rule. It may also be pointed out here that even though education did not percolate downwards, modern ideas did to a large extent, though not in the form desired by the rulers. Through political parties, the press, pamphlets, literature, and public platform, though not through schools and textbooks, the educated Indians or the intellectuals spread the ideas of democracy, nationalism, and anti-imperialism, and social and economic equality and justice among the rural and the urban masses. If the educational system acted as a carrier of these ideas, it did so indirectly by making available to its recipients some of the basic literature in the physical and social sciences, the humanities, and thus stimulating their capacity to make social analysis. Otherwise, the structure, pattern, aims, methods, curricula, and content were all designed to serve colonialism. The Wood's Dispatch, the document dispatched from the Court of Directors and popularly named after Sir Charles Wood, President of the Board of Control, in 1854, was another important step in the development of education in India. The dispatch asked the Government of India to assume responsibility for the education of the masses. It thus repudiated the downward filtration theory. At least on the paper, in practice, the government did little to spread education and spent every little on it. As a result of the directions given by dispatch, departments of education were instituted in all provinces and affiliating institutes and universities were set up in 1857 at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the famous Bengali novelist, became in 1858 one of the first two graduates of the Calcutta University. For all the loud claims that it made, the government of India under the company and later the crown did not really take serious interest in spreading Western learning or any other learning in India. Even the limited effort that was made as a result of factors which had little to do with philanthropic motives of some importance in this aspect was the agitation in favor of modern education by progressive Indians, foreign Christian missionaries, and the humanitarian officials and other Englishmen. But the most important reason was the government's anxiety to economize on the cost of administration by getting cheap supply of educated Indians to man the large and increasing number of subordinate posts in the administration. And the British business concerns, it was manifestly too costly and perhaps not even possible to import enough Englishmen for the purpose. This emphasis on a cheap supply of clerks explains why schools and colleges had to impart modern education, which fitted the recipients for their jobs in the westernized administration of the company, and why these institutions had to emphasize English, which was the language of the masters as well as the language of the administration. Another motive behind the education policy of British sprang from the belief that educated Indians would help expand the market for British manufacturers in India. Lastly, Western education was expected to reconcile the people of India to British rule, particularly as it glorified the British conquerors of India and their administration. Macaulay, for example, laid down, "We must also at present do our best to form the class who may be interpreters between and million of whom we govern. A class of persons, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions and morals, be intellect and in intellect." The British thus wanted to use modern education to strengthen the foundation of their political authority in the country. The traditional Indian system of education gradually withered away for lack of official support, and even more because of official announcement in 1844 that applicants for government employment should possess knowledge of English. This declaration made English medium schools very popular and compelled more and more students to abandon the traditional schools. A major weakness of the education system was the neglect of mass education, with the result that mass literacy in India was hardly better in 1921 than in 1821. As many as 94% of Indians were illiterate in 1911 and 92% in 1921. The emphasis of English as a medium of instruction in place of the Indian languages also preserved the spread of education to the masses. It further tended to create a wide linguistic and cultural gulf between educated persons and the masses. Moreover, because the students had to pay fees in schools and colleges, education was quite costly and became a virtual monopoly of the richer classes and the city dwellers. For nearly 100 years, it was very limited that it failed even to compensate for the ruin of the traditional education system. The major lacuna in early education policy was almost total neglect of education for girls, for which no funds were allocated. This was partly due to the government's anxiety not to hurt the susceptibilities of Orthodox Indians. Even more, it was because female education lacked immediate usefulness in the eyes of the foreign officials, since women could not be employed as clerks in a government. The result was that as late as 1921, 2 out of 100 Indian women were able to read and write, and in 1919, only 490 girls were studying in the 4 top firms of high schools in Bengal Presidency. The company's administration also neglected scientific and technical education. By 1857, there were only 3 medical colleges in the country at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. There were only one good engineering college at Roorkee to impart higher educational and technical education. Even this was open only to Europeans and Eurasians. At the root of many of these weaknesses lay the problem of finance. The government was never willing to spend more than a scanty sum on education. As late as 1886, it devoted only about 1 crore of rupees to education out of its total net revenue of nearly 47 crores. This brings us to the end of chapter number 4. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Please do subscribe and like the channel to get more updates on different preparation for UPSC CSE. All the best everyone. Thank you for listening.